David, welcome.
Thank you.
David, I'd like to kind of go back to the origins of your profession as a physicist, and when you first started to apply what you had learned as a physicist to human consciousness. When did that begin for you?
Well, that's hard to say. I think I was always somewhat interested in the implications of physics for human consciousness. When I learned quantum mechanics, I felt that there was some analogy between consciousness and what we were learning in physics, which came out in my first book, which I wrote, Quantum Theory. The question of movement particularly interested me. Quantum mechanics seems to give a different description of movement than classical theory. In classical theory, movement consists of movement of an object from one place to another through a series of steps that are similar. And in quantum theory, we say that there's a sudden jump from one state to the other without passing through any states that are similar in between. And it seemed that was the way that thought works, too, that you go from one thought to another without continuously passing through thoughts that are in between.
Well, in a sense, when we think, we tend to think in, at least we think in rational, logical sequence, and yet in the midst of that, we frequently have what are called insights or intuitions that kind of pop out in the middle of that kind of break the chain, as it were. How would that relate back to what you were talking about, the quantum mechanics?
Well, even the rational chain goes by steps. You see, you go from one thought to the next by a set of rules. That would be a sort of apparently determinate set of rules. But these rules are not absolutely determinate. There's a great deal of just association, or all sorts of other factors come in, whatever, what you like or dislike.
Is there a way to describe relatively, I realize this is a question that could involve the rest of our conversation, but a way to kind of simply describe quantum theory as related to previous theories of the way the universe works?
Well, I think the major point is to say that it's changes. It's very different in several important respects. The first respect is the one I just stated, that an electron may be said, for example, to jump from one orbit to the other without passing in between. Now, secondly, it is not completely deterministic. That is, there's only a statistical determination on the average of what is going to happen. But if we start from a certain state, and there are many possible states which may emerge from this that are not determined by the theory. And the third point is that the nature of the particle, the nature of the entity, whether wave or particle, seems to depend on how it's treated. That is, an electron may behave like a wave or like a particle, in some way more like a living being, who may depend on how it's treated rather than like a mechanical system. And then I should say there's a fourth very important respect we might come to, that there seems to be a non-local connection of things, whereas in classical physics everything is connected either with things that are in contact or extremely close.
What kind of implications does that kind of a theory hold for us when applied to human consciousness?
Well, it doesn't tell you directly, except insofar as people have commonly thought that consciousness should be based on classical physical ideas, that eventually consciousness might be explained as some sort of computer or life, and it could be explained mechanically through DNA and so on. Now, the very laws by which the molecules are formed are quite contrary to these determinate mechanical laws. And certainly at the small-scale level, something very different happens, which is more like what we experience in our own consciousness than it is like a machine. Now, I think many scientists, if not most, are thinking that in large masses of matter, such as we have in the brain, this will not be important. But it doesn't follow that this or something similar to it is not important, you see. That is, I think that is an assumption which, could not possibly have been proved at present.
If we move over to the great spiritual traditions, the way of the sage, and in some respects the way of the philosopher, we find that in the area of meditation, the great sages have told us that we have to go beyond the mind, we have to go beyond thinking, and meditation is a way to move into another level of consciousness or to move beyond consciousness as we understand it. And I'm wondering how that idea of meditation relates to what you're talking about on the physical side.
Yes, well, well, perhaps I could say that when I first learned quantum theory, I had the feeling that one could feel what it meant inwardly in a way you can't describe, that
Beyond words.
beyond words. And this was one of the reasons why I was so interested in it. But if I try to indicate what I mean now, just one of the points I just said, that the nature of the thing depends on how it's what its environment is, and the fact that something may move from one state to another without passing through states in between. Now, but in some way, it seems to transform fundamentally rather than pass through intermediate states. Now, I would say, suppose you were to take the question of yourself. You say, one may think that I exist continuously in time, you see, but I've not proved that. Every time I look, I'm there, you see. And then I assume that if I looked in between, I would be there too. But there's no proof of that either. You see, do I exist in an identified form except when I'm thinking I am there, right? Or is there not some other deeper level through which I pass from one identified form to another? Is that clear what I'm driving at?
Yes. I'm recalling as you're talking a Buddhist meditation technique of focusing on the space between thoughts.
Yes, and if you take the space in quantum theory, we have an observation of an electron and another observation, and it's totally unable to account for what is in between. It is nothing like the end results or the beginning, right? In fact, it doesn't discuss it at all, the theory, but the sort of thinking I've been developing would rather put it into another domain of existence, much subtler and deeper.
Yeah. There was an experiment that you mentioned in your book, Wholeness in the Implicate Order, of where you had a viscous fluid in the lab in London where you were showing the principle of enfoldment and unfoldment. Yeah. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that. Yes,
well, this was an illustration that I developed. In fact, I first thought of it while watching a program on the BBC television, and they showed two cylinders of glass, one concentric cylinders, one being fixed at the center, and the outward cylinder, being slowly rotated. In between was a viscous fluid such as glycerine, and into that you placed a drop of insoluble ink, right? Now, if you imagine what happens, imagine the fluid which holds the ink. The elements of fluid are being drawn out because the outer parts are turning faster than the inner parts, and therefore any element of fluid is drawn out into a fine thread, and with it, the ink goes with it, right? And eventually the ink spreads out so far that it's not visible. You would think it's random. You would say it's not even there to perception. But now you turn the cylinder backward. Now, it's essential that this be a very viscous medium, or else the ink particles will have diffused all over the fluid. But if it's very viscous, then the fluid element retraces its path and eventually comes back to its original form, taking the ink particles with it, and suddenly the ink droplet emerges out of nothing. After, if you keep on turning, it will go back in. Now, I call that, I call that the enfolded or implicate order, because you could say that the ink was folded into the fluid like an egg is folded into a cake. Of course, you cannot unfold the egg because it's not viscous.
And then when applied to consciousness, that would imply that our consciousness is enfolded in implicate
yes,
as well.
That's right. And the very word, we say a thought is implicit, which has the same root as implicate. You see, the word implicate means to enfold in Latin, implicare. The word multiplication means multifold. See, duplication means twofold, and so on. Replication, fold again. And implicate means fold inward, and explicate means fold outward or unfold. Right. So now the word implicit in thought has the same root. You see, if we say a thought is implicit, that would suggest at least that we have the sense that it's enfolded, and it comes out. Now, it may come out in a logical order, but it may come out in many other orders. You see, the unfolded thought, logic is only a very special case of how those thoughts are connected, just as classical physics is a very special case of how events are connected.
I'm speaking with the physicist David Bohm. We'll return to our conversation in just a moment. J. Krishnamurti is a world-famous explorer of consciousness and philosopher in his own right. And David, you've spent the last 20 years off and on spending time with Krishnamurti, exploring consciousness with him in dialogue. And I'm wondering, how did you first come in touch with Krishnamurti?
Yes, well, I was in Bristol in England, and my wife and I used to go to the public library there and looking up philosophy books, and she found a book on Krishnamurti, and it mentioned in there the observer and the observed. Now, I had often talked about that in quantum theory because that is one of the points about quantum theory that I neglected to mention, that because the quantum of energy is indivisible, the connection between the observing instrument and what is observed cannot be divided. You get a certain wholeness, or oneness, rather, of the observer and the observed. The observer and the observed are one, right? And now when she saw the phrase, the observer and the observed probably are one, and not exactly those words, but meaning that, then she thought it might be something to do with quantum mechanics, so she showed the book to me, and I found it extremely interesting. It was a book on the mind, obviously, not on quantum mechanics. But a very similar question arises, which I had been very interested in for many, many years in connection with physics, only directly in connection with the mind, right? That he goes, of course, into a wide range of questions, not merely that one, but which all of which I found interesting. And so later on, we wrote to the publisher and eventually found he was going to be in London, and we met him and had a very nice conversation. I was sort of talking very naturally, and I talked a lot about my ideas in physics, which he probably had a vague intuitive feeling for. But we went on then from year by year to discuss all sorts of other things, and eventually he started some schools in England and other places, and I became interested in those. And since then we have had discussions also on which we have gone into tapes and television.
Do you think that there are parallels between the work of the quantum physicist and the work of the mystic philosopher?
Well, yes, there seems to be a kind of parallel, a number of parallels. You see, I think that myself that the implicate order is a kind of parallel, but that the reality is enfolded, as it were, and rather than being displayed directly. But this question of the observer and the observed was the one that first got me interested. This has been one of the basic difficulties of those who want to look into the mind and want to be free of the ordinary state of consciousness with its limitations. The fact that one senses that if you are looking into your mind, you seem to be different from what you are looking at, as if you were looking at the table. Now, if you look at that for a while, you see you can't be that separation must be illusory. Now, Krishnamurti, as well as others, have made it clear that this illusory separation is one of the things that holds us. This illusory sense of separation within the mind is one of the things that holds us in the ordinary state of consciousness.
That might be parallel to the ego?
The ego, that's basically involved. This separation is a basic aspect of the ego, that the ego is constantly trying to control itself and make itself fit a pattern, and in order to do so, it pretends that it is made of two parts, one of which is the part which has to be controlled, and the other part is trying to control it.
If one accepts quantum theory, one throws objectivity out the window, doesn't one?
Well, not exactly. You see, in the same sense that we can say that if I look at the table, I can say that there's a fairly good, the table and me are fairly independent, you see. Now, the essential point is, what is the degree of independence, you see. Now, if you take, for example, a blind man who is tapping with a stick and holding the stick tightly, he feels his body ends at the end of the stick. If he holds the stick loosely, he feels that he ends at his fingers, right? He may even think about his feelings and try to look at them as if they were different, as if they were loosely connected to him. Or you can extend outward and include other people, your group, your society, identify with that and say, that's me. And I think, say, some people have said it goes all the way out to the whole universe and say, that's me, or vice versa, the whole universe. We can bring it all the way in and say the universe is me in the opposite sense, which I think many mystics have looked at that way. And they see the boundaries, the question is the boundary of any two things can only be properly established where there's a loose connection. Now, inside the mind, there's not a loose connection. You see that you can say if somebody is angry, you may try to look at his anger, but his thoughts are tightly connected to the anger, and really, in a way, it's the anger that is thinking. It's distorted, and the thought is maintaining the anger. So, as an example, that when you are trying to look at yourself, whether it be anger or pleasure or fear or desire or intellectual conviction or various other things, whatever would be called the observer is not sufficiently independent of what is called the observed, so that they form two systems, but rather they are one. Right? Now, if you treat them as if they are treated as two, there's tremendous confusion, and this confusion, according to Krishnamurti, is the basic state, is behind the basic difficulties of the ordinary state of mind.
Yeah, I'm wondering, just with respect to going back to consciousness and the relationship that we have to the events that we see outside of ourselves, if one applies what you're talking about, it means that if we view a problem out there, see a problem and become identified with the problem, part of it is identifying that we're part of the problem.
Yes.
In the very fact of seeing it, right?
Well, insofar as we have any intention toward it, it becomes part of us, and we become part of it, right? If we could look at it neutrally, completely neutrally and just in an unbiased way, then we would not be part of the problem. But you see, the basic point is thought does not do that. That is another point Krishnamurti is constantly emphasizing. That is, he says ordinary awareness is dominated by choice. That is, we are aware according to what we like and dislike. And that is not an objective, that is not an actual fact, right? But it's distorted. Now, he emphasizes the need for what he calls choiceless awareness, in which you are not identified with what you see either inwardly or outwardly, so that it becomes possible to see it without, however, but then there's no division of the inward and the outward. Both must be treated in the same way.
So would there be choiceless awareness in quantum theory?
Well, probably not the way it is now. You see, the apparatus makes a choice as to whether it's going to be observing a wave-like or a particle-like. Really, the experimenter has made that choice when he made the apparatus. Right? So it's analogous. I wouldn't say it's actually a choice in our sense, but a choice of some kind has been made that we are going to bring out one side or the other of the electron, you see.
You mentioned something about theory and the origin of the word theory in your book, Wholeness and the Implicate Order, and I thought it was a salient point because a theory, we tend to identify theories as somehow factual and truthful, and theories have essentially formulated our way of looking at the world. And you pointed out that when Einstein came along and the theory of relativity, there was like a dismissal of the Newtonian, and it was like, well, we set aside one truth and we adopted another truth, and most of the time we're not aware of setting aside one truth and adopting another truth.
No, that's a very deep and complex set of questions. But see, the word theory comes from the Greek word theoria, which has the same root as the word theater, meaning to view, and that would suggest that a theory is a kind of theater of the mind. You see, now in a theater, in a drama, you don't see actual facts, but we are seeing something which throws light on the human situation, for example. But the theory is a sort of a reflection on this actual fact in a general way, showing the general order of the thing rather than particular. And now each theory then, when it's accepted, provides a way of looking at the world. It will select certain ways of looking and certain things that are important. As, for example, Newtonian theory says what's important is the positions and momentum of particles, And the quantum theory says that something entirely different is important, energy levels and probabilities. And therefore the fact is given shape by the theory that you have accepted. But that's a two-way interaction, that the fact may lead you to change the theory, and the theory, however, tends to make you put the fact into a certain form.
Well, in a culture that places a great deal of emphasis on intellectual analysis, what do you see the implications of quantum theory being on the whole process of Western intellectual pursuits?
Yes, well, I don't think that the meaning of this theory has been really absorbed significantly into Western culture. It has tended to become a very technical thing, partly because no attempt is made seriously to, generally speaking, to interpret it or to show its meaning, but rather it is treated as a way of calculating things, and therefore of extending our knowledge of prediction and control of nature, right?
Why do you think that is, David?
Well, I think it's intrinsic to some extent. To a certain extent, it's due to a lot of fortuitous developments, but it's intrinsic in our whole way of looking at things, which emphasizes just that Western society has grown out of this. And since there was not obvious how you could develop an interpretation of quantum theory, people fairly readily gave up the attempt to interpret it and reduced it more or less to a set of formulae. And you could say, mathematical formulae, that is, and you could say that in principle what they're trying to do is to get a set of formulae which would enable you in principle to calculate anything. That would be the ideal. And I would say that even if you had that, we ought to understand what it means. But since it is not understood what quantum theory means, people on the whole, the general public, have only the faintest notion of the implications of this theory.
If one accepts quantum theory, one would have to change the definition of how we now interpret science, wouldn't one?
Yes, because if you accept that the fundamental laws of matter are of this nature, then we say that it's true we have the classical laws coming out as approximations, but they are secondary, and these are this is the primary fundamental nature of matter, which is far more subtle than we had thought, and it might open the way to discovering that it's even more subtle still if we went further.
I'm speaking with David Bohm, physicist and author of Wholeness in the Implicate Order. We're going to continue our conversation and our exploration of physics, quantum physics, and human consciousness in just a moment. David, recently you spent some time with the biochemist Rupert Sheldrake, who has postulated a theory of his own, morphogenetic field, morphogenesis, and morphic resonance, and the idea that somehow there's an effect that causes change that we don't really understand at the moment, but essentially it's an interesting theory.
Yes.
And I'm wondering how a theory like that would fit within your idea of the implicate order.
Yes, well, Rupert Sheldrake has proposed that there might be what is called a formative field for each organism, or for organisms in general, that would not be located in time and space in any clearly defined way, and that this would be gradually affected by organisms of a similar nature to sort of accumulate certain forms that would be emphasized as the kind of average of all the all the forms that had been taken by members of that species. And I've discussed this with him, and I would say that, the implicate order is a more general idea, but it could include this sort of idea. It's rather hard to explain, but in the implicate order we think of this unfoldment which I have described earlier. We think of an electron unfolding. See, we may imagine that there's not just one ink droplet, but a large number have been unfolded, such that one comes out, then another, then another. The model of the electron would be that it's going very fast, so fast that to ordinary measurements it appears to be continuously existent, as in a cine camera. The frames are so close together they appear continuous. Now, so we say that the electron is, as it were, enfolded in something deeper. And the question is, why is it an electron and not a proton or something else? Now, see, this could be understood if we thought of this as a two-way process, that when something had unfolded, it was folded back in such a way as to tend to affect the next unfoldment. And therefore, one could see that something is enfolded into a large region of space, in principle extremely large, and gradually a kind of memory of all that had happened would tend to accumulate in there, which would tend to stabilize what was going to follow.
Almost like a genetic memory.
Yes, well, not the present theory, but a little bit like it. But this wouldn't be located in a definite point in space. It would be rather spread out, you see. We don't know how far, but and this is just the sort of thing that Rupert Sheldrake is proposing.
So sort of a cosmogenetic memory.
Yes, an enfolded memory. And in fact, I think Pribram has proposed a theory in which our memory is enfolded too, but the enfolded order can be found quite commonly, but...
You mentioned Carl Pribram, one of the theorists about a holographic model of the brain. How would that idea of the brain, the holographic model, relate to the implicate order?
Well, there would be a relationship in the sense that he has proposed that memories and perceptions are, and the way the brain works is such that we, for example, don't say that each object is remembered at a certain cell in the brain, but rather the information for each object is diffused through the whole brain, just as in a hologram, the information you see, and also any part of the brain contains information about the whole. That is, in some sense it would unfold. And therefore there would be a similarity between what I've said about matter. But I think that to make the similarity complete, we won't have to go further and bring in more of the quantum theory.
Going back to what you were saying earlier about how quantum theory has been essentially mechanized by modern science and not really explored in all of its dimensions with other aspects of life. And what about that? What about that? How do you see quantum theory applying to other parts of life? Say, taking it outside of science for a moment.
Well, you don't directly apply it, you see, but let me show how theories affect life. You see, now, originally, you see, there's no original. We can't go back to the beginning of time. But at a certain time, say 1,000 years ago, people generally looked at the world as, say, organized with man at the center, the earth at the center, and they felt it had a purpose and it was almost alive, right? And that then came the mechanistic. Then came the theories which followed on Newton, which reduced everything to a gigantic machine that had no meaning, in which, say, the Earth was a tiny grain way off to the side of the universe, and man was a tiny little organism on that. So it would put man in a very unimportant position. Now, that way of thinking evidently affects the approach to life as a whole. That it favors the idea that we are mechanical, that we can be treated as machines and analyzed and so on. And also, it tends to take a lot of the meaning out of life. That is, people would say that even I think Steven Weinberg, who was one of the leading physicists of our time, theoretical physicists, has quoted as saying that he sees no meaning in the universe, and he says somewhere else he said, although I may be inaccurate about this, that life is a farce, but that understanding it in physics raises it at least to the level of a tragedy. I hope I've quoted him correctly. And that shows the kind of psychological effect of the view of life, because although there's a lot of trouble now, there was in human life, there was also plenty of trouble 1,000 years ago. But I don't think people would have said that at that time.
In some sense, science has mechanized and rationalized to the point where somehow the deeper essence, the deeper meaning of life is lost.
It more or less denies that any deeper meaning exists other than the mechanical meaning.
Now, you as a quantum physicist and theorist is coming forward and saying that quantum theory and the implicate order essentially implies there is deeper meaning.
There may be. You see, it doesn't show there is, but it's compatible with a deeper meaning. Whereas the mechanistic view doesn't seem to be compatible with one, at least very difficult to make it so. Now, in the time of Newton, for example, most of the scientists were still extremely religious, and what they said was God had created the universe as if it were a clock, you see, and clockwork. And one side said he made it perfect and it just ran, and the other side said occasionally it broke down and he repaired it by means of miracles. But they were still giving some kind of meaning to it. But of course that has gradually evaporated. And if you think of what science implies about the universe and so on, and what biology with DNA implies about life, we could say it has no more meaning ultimately than a computer, right?
Coming out of the more complex and trying to get simpler, I'm thinking about the implications for the practice of meditation, which essentially is a practice designed to move oneself out of one's thinking process into another area. How would you relate quantum theory to that process of meditation?
Well, I don't know exactly how I would do that. You see, I think that insofar as it suggests this implicate order, right, it suggests that, first of all, I'd say it suggests the need to see the mind as one rather than as fragmented into many, right? And therefore, for example, into the observer and the observed. Secondly, it's a question of what is the meaning of experience, especially inward experience. Now, see that there's a word another word for unfold, which is display, having the same root as unfold, displicare, but it's unfolded for the sake of showing something rather than unfolded for its own sake. Now, there are two ways to look at thought, you see, and feeling and desire and will. One way is to look at that content for its own sake and say, my thoughts, feelings, desire, and will, which is fundamental parts of consciousness, are significant for that in themselves in that way, right? Now, very often they are very confused. Right? Now, you can look at it another way and say they are a display of something enfolded out of which they emerge. Is that clear what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. For example, in England we have what's called a display card in television, which is put out by the station, which consists of lines and pictures, which everybody knows. And they're not interesting in themselves, you see, but they are interesting in that they display whether your set is working properly or not. Now, similarly, you see, the picture may be interesting in itself, or it may be interesting as a display of how the set is working. Now, similarly with the mind, you see, what's going on in the mind may be interesting for its own content, or as a display of how the deeper mind is working, whether it's orderly or not. Now, I've discussed this off with Krishnamurti, and I think, and the point which he makes is that an orderly mind is essential for whatever is meant by meditation.
When he says orderly mind, what do you think he means?
He means, to begin with, order in everyday life, order in your thoughts, order in your feelings, you see, order in your relationships, and from that emerges the ability to look deeper, right?
Couldn't one say that's a rather mechanistic view?
No, because as long as that level of order is not there, the rest will be disrupted, you see. That is, if you have disorder in your daily life and in your thoughts, your brain and mind are going to be so turbulent that the deeper order will not show, right? It's like saying, if you have a lot of fog around, you can't drive your car. It's and all the interesting places you could go to are inaccessible. Right?
So as we become more clear and more ordered in our life, it allows more order to flow through.
Yes, and
deeper levels of that order.
Yeah, as the clarity then allows this to unfold and show, right? And to get into something deeper. But you see, it's essential to be constantly aware of this disorder, which tends to come, and which practically all societies have had. You see,
Most of us tend to see that disorder outside of ourselves as opposed to inside
well, that's
of ourselves.
an essential point, and I think Krishnamurti makes this very well, that this disorder originates inside of ourselves, and it's propagated from outside to inside. Any disorder outside becomes a disorder inside, but ultimately all the disorder outside was produced by us, you see, and it's a reflection of our own internal disorder. It's the unfoldment of our internal disorder into the external world, right?
And we hear the statement made, well, I'm not responsible for hunger and starvation in India. I have nothing to do with that.
Yes, that separates you from the rest. See, that puts the boundary of you at your skin. You see, now, essentially, nobody is bounded at his skin. All his thoughts have come from the society, and his whole existence depends on other people, now not only physically, but mentally. If people are put in tanks of water, in which they have no sensations, they find the order of the mind may tend to go to pieces. We need to be getting impressions from all around, apparently, to maintain the internal order. If we get disorderly impressions, they will be disorderly. So the disorder in India is already my disorder. And also, in some sense, I am responsible insofar as I accept the way of thinking which has produced that disorder in India. In another context, I am just as responsible as the whatever is going on there in India. That because if I were in India thinking that way, I would do exactly the same, unless I really understood carefully what is driving these people in India to do whatever they're doing and creating this messy situation about food.
So in a sense, the idea of the implicate order is one that would allow us to understand our connection with our fellow humans.
Yes, because it would say all consciousness is one, unfolding and unfolding. At least it's communicating in sound and light and so on, and possibly at some deeper level we are all connected, unbeknownst to us. Very probably, I would say.
Let's hope so. I'm speaking with David Bohm, author of Wholeness in the Implicate Order. We're going to continue in just a moment. David, Krishnamurti has always emphasized the value of one's own experience and tends to always push one back upon oneself. And in that process has always seemingly talked about the danger of belief systems and identifying with belief systems. And when we talk about the implicate order, and are we not talking about just another belief system?
Yes, that's a good question. It depends on your attitude toward it. You see, there's another point Krishnamurti makes, is that your approach, your attitude is more important than the content and the detailed content of what you're talking about. Now, one attitude is...
If we can simplify that, one's intention
yes,
is really more important than one's action.
Yes, because unless the intention is clear, the action is eventually going to come out wrong. You see, momentarily it may be right, but it's going to go wrong. Now, the attitude I would suggest for the implicate order is that we regard it as a proposal, that is literally something put forth for exploration. And we will explore it and go along with it as far as we can until we find possibly where it may not work. I think every scientific theory should be looked at that way. And I suggest that it is a more intelligible and rational proposal than the present theory as far as understanding quantum theory and life as a whole is concerned. And it would be worth exploring, and maybe someday it's up to any person whether he wants to go on with it or not, of course. I don't want to push it on anybody. But that this may well be explored and eventually perhaps lead to something else.
In a sense, going back to the notion of belief systems, a belief system is something that really tends to provide an external form of order that we place on ourselves that perhaps is a substitute for the order you were talking about earlier that can be developed inwardly.
Yes, you see, the inward order is not fixed in any form. It's constantly being discovered, right? Unfolding, manifesting itself. But the belief system is an imposition of order and is therefore mechanical. Now, if you think of belief, you see, why should you believe it? You see, if I come out and tell you the implicate order, why should you believe it? You see, you can look at the evidence and you can be skeptical, and say, at some stage you may say it looks plausible. I mean, I'd like to look into it. But in any case, there's no reason to have a final belief in anything. You could say, I will accept it as a working a supposition. I will go see how far it goes. I mean, you may hold to it. You say, I'm so confident about it that I will use it until I find evidence against it. Right?
In your explorations of consciousness, have you come to kind of understand the difference between, say, belief and faith?
Well, I don't know. You see, the word faith, I like to look up the meanings of words, and the word faith is based on persuasion or conviction. You see that convincing means to win over. Faith means winning over in its Greek root, pistis, and it also means to persuade. The word persuade is based on the same root as suave and sweet. That is, you can be won over by sweet words or by powerful words. But I think people have an intention when they use the word faith, which is beyond any meaning that you can give to the word. You see that the word, it's very hard to distinguish the word faith from belief in its actual derivation and the way. But I think that there's a certain kind of confidence in life that one which is meant. You see that which is not entirely based on evidence.
There's a certain kind of knowing.
Well, sort of trust or in the whole. But it is not exactly a belief either. I mean, no particular content of belief is involved. Right?
Yeah. So are we talking about a new religion, a new theology?
Well, I don't know. You see, I think that one has to be careful about religion. What does it really mean? You see, what is the attitude or intention behind it? I think I once read somewhere that there were three basic attitudes. There's an ancient wisdom, actually, of the scientific, the artistic, and the religious. And science deals with knowledge, clearly. Art with harmony and creation. And religion, if you take the root of the word, well, the word holy means whole. And the root religere, the Latin root of religion, means to gather together, basically, or to pay attention. And you could say that religion would properly be man's interest in wholeness, right? But insofar as you begin to fix that in beliefs and or structures and so on, it becomes fragmentary. You see, health also is based on the word whole, and we used to make a joke by passing the health department, calling it the Department of Wholeness. Showing the contradiction which was in our society. And in a way, religion should not be a department, but an attitude, and should not have any fixed beliefs, but should be compatible with the scientific attitude in the sense that it's constantly inquiring rather than based on accepting beliefs.
So it's not so much the answers as asking the right question.
Yeah, and being ready to question anything. You see, I think Krishnamurti likes to say that a religious attitude must be ready to question anything, you see. Now that is quite contrary to what people often mean by religion. But if you go back to the deepest spirit of the thing, which man seems always to have had, I think you could see that that's correct.
What have you learned from your 20-so years with working with Krishnamurti?
Well, you can't say. I mean, I've tried to indicate some of it.
Yeah.
You see, I think the major point is to learn, that thought, that failure to understand how the mind works is the cause of our difficulties, and you can look at the mind and observe it in such a way that it will come to order.
And that starts with the simple first step.
Yes.
One step in front of the other.
Yeah.
think all too often we tend to become oppressed by the gigantic size of it all out there as we look around. How could I possibly affect any change? And it's really a matter of coming back to the micro.
Yeah, you've got to begin where you are, And the thing is, the implicate order suggests that it's all the same. Wherever you are is in contact with everything in the whole. And so
seeing oneself as a small part is really not the appropriate attitude.
No, we're not just a small part. We are the whole. That we emerge from the whole, and the quality of the whole is in each element. And there is a kind of contact with the whole if you if we bring order into this part.
So in a sense, when Christ said, "I and the Father are one," he was talking about the implicate order.
Maybe, yes. Yes, I think that could be looked at that way.
What do you think the future holds for quantum theory, and particularly the implicate order?
Well, I don't know the future, really. Only a few of us have been working on it so far, and it depends really on how well it's taken up. You see, I think it has potential for a great deal of development and discovery of new aspects of physics, and also connecting with consciousness and having implications for biology and society.
How have other physicists related to the idea?
Well, very few have really taken it up. People outside of physics have been much more interested. There are a few, you see, but on the whole, I think physicists don't quite understand why I'm going in for all this, you see. Why should I bother with all this stuff?
It's kind of indicative of the way life seems to work sometimes, that one doesn't recognize things until after they've become real.
Yes, well, you see, that's what I've explained, that people have taken the main purpose of physics to be the prediction and control of matter, and not particularly to understand deeply what it means. Right? And in fact, some people say it doesn't mean anything at all, as I said before.
Yeah. Where do you see your own work taking you?
Well, in physics, I'm going further into understanding nature of space and time as unfolding from something deeper, and to bring in greater unity into the whole thing.
It's a worthy quest.
What?
It's a worthy quest. David, I want to thank you for being with us today.
Right, thank you.
I've been speaking with physicist David Bohm, author of Wholeness in the Implicate Order. My name is Michael Toms, and on behalf of the entire New Dimensions radio family, I'm wishing you well.